I'm starting a new series, and I title it Launch Out. Launch Out. If you would notice, in our backdrop, we have a picture of a person drawing a net of fish. And then in our declaration, we also talk about the Lord commanding us to launch out, and at His word we cast our nets. Because everything we say is thematic to how we want the year to be. So I'm doing what I think will be a 5-part series, a 5-part message. And this is part 1 of Launch Out. And my subtitle is Into the Deep. Into the deep. My text is taken from Luke's Gospel, chapter 5, from verses 1 to 4. Luke's Gospel, chapter 5, verses 1 to 4. So it was, as the multitude pressed about him to hear the word of God, that he stood by the lake Gennesaret and saw 2 boats standing by the lake. But the fishermen had gone from them and were washing their nets. Then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. And when he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, "Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." The passage shows 2 events that are taking place here. And the 2 events involve 2 people doing different things, but what they're doing is related. The first event involves Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ has just begun his ministry, and he's preaching around his hometown lake. The Lake Gennesaret is sometimes also called the Lake of Galilee. And the reason it's called Lake Gennesaret here is because the Lake of Galilee covers a lot of towns and villages. And so when it's within a certain village, the villagers name it after their village. So the Lake of Galilee, the part near the village of Gennesaret, is called the Lake of Gennesaret, just for your biblical knowledge. And so Jesus is around and he's preaching, and a crowd has gathered to listen to him. And so Jesus is facing a crowd. And the crowd is all around Jesus, so large that he could not preach to them. And the reason he couldn't preach to them is, you just imagine that there is a crowd pressing in on Jesus. He's at the beach. Behind him is a lake, is the water. And the people are pressing in to hear him. Of course, if he moves any further, he's going to fall into the water. So he needs space to minister. He needs a space to preach the word of God in. So Jesus has a problem, which I call the space problem, because crowd requires space. One of the challenges of growth of any kind is growth will present to you the challenge of space. When a church grows, it will face a challenge of space. Where do you accommodate your members, adults and children? Where do people park their cars? If a family grows, it will have a problem of space. Where do you put the children and all the possessions that you are accumulating? When a business grows, it will face a challenge of space, office, warehouses, shops. So Jesus has a problem of space, and the problem of space is because there is a crowd. It's a good problem. It's a good problem when your problem is that you have too much. So he has a lot of crowd. The crowd is pressing in. He has no space, and he needs to preach to them. So that's the first event, the problem with Jesus. The second event involves Peter. Peter is also in the same place. He's around the Lake Gennesaret. He has an empty boat. And there's no fisherman in the boat, and there's nothing in his boat. It's a big contrast from Jesus. One has a problem of a multitude crowd. The other has a problem of emptiness. Nothing. Both at the same lake. It's very interesting how you see this contrast in the Bible. and how the Bible shows us pictures as we read them. So here is Jesus. He has a problem. Too many people. Here is Peter. He has a problem. Nothing. One is empty, one is overflowing. Somehow these two events, personalities, and their problems are going to converge. There's going to be a meeting place between Jesus and Peter, between a multitude and emptiness, between an empty boat and a crowd that is facing Jesus Christ. And these are the issues that are facing them. Jesus is dealing with success. Peter is coping with a failed mission. One has begun his ministry and is doing so well. The other began a long time and is not doing well. Can failure and success converge? Well, somehow in between these two events there's a convergence. And when the two events converge, something interesting happened. Jesus used the instrument of Peter's failed mission to successfully carry out his divine mission. What Peter considers a failure, an empty boat, Jesus takes that empty boat and he uses the empty boat with no fish, with a depressed fisherman who feels like he has failed. Jesus takes it and he uses it successfully. It's amazing about Jesus and what he can do with your life. What you call failure, he can take it and use it to achieve something great. What you think is the end of your life, he can take it and begin something fresh with your life. When you think it's over, he says, I'm beginning. And that's what he does for Peter. Peter thinks, I have failed. Jesus says, you have no idea how to spell failure. Because when I encounter your life, what you think is failure will be turned to success. I don't know about you, but I believe there's somebody here this morning with an empty boat, frustrated and wondering, how am I not making it? And I came to announce to you the same Jesus who turned an empty boat into a platform of success is going to take your empty boat and turn it into a platform of success. It's not the end yet. You are frustrated, but the Messiah is here and he will turn the negative into a positive. So Jesus took what was considered a failure and made it a success. And for that to happen, we come back to the purpose of this message. Jesus said to Peter, launch out. Everybody say launch out. Launch out. Now, this word launch out, from the Greek epanago, that's the root word of it, launch out, is used twice in the passage. Now, depending on which version of the Bible you're using, you may think it's used only once, but it's used twice in the Bible, in the passage. Now, I'm going to show that to you very shortly. But it's a very important word. Launch out. Everybody say launch out. How many of you feel like you need to launch out? You need to launch out and do something. What does it mean to launch out? It means to move away from something. To move away from something. Launching out will take you away from something. Usually it is something that is familiar to you, something that you know, something you've done over and over and over. When you launch out, you are moving away. But that's not the only meaning of launch out. Launch out also means to move further into something. Launching out will take you into something new. So when we launch out, when God tells us to launch out, he's telling you, move away from something. When he tells you to launch out, he's telling you first, move away from something. But that's not all. He's also telling you, move into something. Because sometimes and many times, for you to move into something new, you have to move away from something old. For you to move into success, you move away from failure. And sometimes the things you have to move away from are things that are familiar to you. It may be a mindset, it may be a practice, it may be something you do all the time. But when God comes into your boat, when Jesus comes into your boat, you're going to launch out. Somebody say, I'm launching out. And that's what he said to Peter. Launch out. Launch out. If you look into the passage, as I said, there are two ways to launch out. There are two ways that Jesus used the phrase launch out. Two ways. The first one is in verse 3. And it says, then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the disciples from the boat. Now note that in my King James, New King James Version, it says put out. But in the Greek, it's epenago. It's the same word, epenago. When Jesus says, launch out the first time, he says, move out. Move from where you are. And he said to Peter, put out, move from where you are. And he told him how far he should go. He says, move from the land, but don't move too far from the land. Put out a little from the land. A little from the land. It's a launching out, but it's not into the deep. It's a little from the land. You know, many times when God wants you to do something great, he doesn't start for you to do something that is so demanding of you that you are not able to do it. He can start with some first step, and then there's going to be a second step. So the first time Jesus says to Peter, launch out, he didn't say to the deep. He said, launch out just a little from the land. Of course, practically, it was serving a practical purpose because the crowd was there at the shore. Jesus steps into Peter's boat, and the crowd is at the shore. If they go into the deep, then Jesus cannot minister to the crowd. So this first launch out is just move a bit from the land. Just sufficient so that when I speak, they will still hear me. But it also tells us that sometimes when we are launching out, we are moving from something. They're moving from the land into the sea. But it's not a very far away space. You know, many times when people want to attempt to do something big for God, we want to also start big. We want to launch out big. Sometimes you admire the way people launch their businesses or launch a product. They're going to have a big band and a big tent, and they're going to try to invite the president and ministers of state, and they'll invite maybe King Charles of in England, and then nobody shows up. Have you ever been to a lunch that every invited guest didn't show up? You know what they were trying to do? They were launching out into the deep when they should be launching just a little further from the land. Because when you are unknown, nobody will come to your lunch. Nobody will come to your party. You have to start and prove something before you go into the deep. And Jesus said to Peter, just a little from the land. You're going to do great things, but start one step at a time, one small step at a time. And don't be afraid to take a little step, because that little step is not your final step. It's only the first step. And it's going to take you somewhere. We started our church in a classroom. We are in this auditorium. The first step was not here. I couldn't even have imagined this possibility. There was no way it's going to happen. I didn't have the capacity. I didn't have the resources. I didn't have the mindset. I didn't have the maturity to pastor thousands of people. My maturity level was to pastor just 20 people, make all my mistakes with 20 people. So when I get 20,000, I would have solved all my problems and not be making many mistakes before a large crowd. Because if you make big mistakes before a big crowd, you blow your chance forever. But if you make your big mistakes before small people, they will forgive you easily. And even if they don't forgive you and they go, it's just 20 people. The challenge with many people is that when they launch out, they want to launch big. Like these days, on social media, people are doing big things. They post big things. Nobody comments. Nobody watches. And they feel very important that they are, I'm changing the world. We are influencing the world, but nobody's reading your comments. Just get it in your head. You're not changing anything. The first thing you need to change is not the world, it's your mind. Launch out a little from the sea. That's what Jesus said to Peter. He's moving from something into something, but not in a big way. Second time the phrase is used, most of you are familiar with it. After Jesus had ministered to the crowd, he used the word again in verse 4. Launch out your boat into the deep. Into the deep. First time, launch out a little. Second time, into the deep. What does it mean to go into the deep? It means go beyond the surface. The word deep there, as it is used in the word in the verse, is literally the deep seas. The deep seas. One thing about the deep sea, it's far away from the land. When you are in trouble in the deep sea, land is far away from you. And the other thing about the deep sea is that it is deep. If you fall into the deep sea, you are going deep. You can't swim around the deep sea if you don't know how to swim. There's like some of us who don't swim. When I was a kid, and we go out to swim, I just have to make sure I'm very close to the land. Very close. If the wave is coming, run to land. But even no matter how bad you are, if you are close to the land, you can go back. But if you go to the deep seas and something goes wrong, you are in trouble. So Jesus says, launch out into the deep. But he said, launch out into the deep after he had said, launch out a little. And the instructive thing the Lord wants us to learn is that he leads us in phases. He leads us in steps. Sometimes we have to do big things, mighty things, deep things. Sometimes you have to attempt something bold and audacious. But before you attempt something bold and audacious, you should have attempted something small and significant. David didn't start with Goliath. He started with a lion and a bear. You want to do something big, you're going to launch out. But you have to determine, am I launching a little so I can launch deeper? Or I'm going to start without any experience to try to launch out deeper. And if you try to launch very deep, you can get lost in the deep. Because the deep is deep. The deep is far. This year, there will be people who will launch out into the deep. Because you've been at the shore for too long. You launched out a little so long ago. Now you have to take a bold step. I remember the first time we took our crossover event to the stadium. We had been in our church, Christ Temple West, for a long time. We started crossover. We filled the auditorium. We filled the outside. And then we filled, those of you who were there, we filled the car park. Then we filled the games court. Then now people are standing on the street. So I knew we have moved out a little, launch out a little. And if you don't take time, you stay a little for a long time. So one Sunday, I said, well, this year, crossover, we are going to the Accra Sports Stadium. That is into the deep. But it was possible because we had mastered launching out a little from the land. You don't start and say, I'm going to fill the Accra Sports Stadium. The stadium will swallow you. And it can break your confidence. It can break your confidence. So 2 levels of launching out. Launching out a little from the land and launching out into the deep.
We've come to the end of this video. We believe you've been blessed. Remember, God's love is steadfast and unchanging. May His grace and peace be with you always. If you're new here, consider subscribing to stay up to date with our videos. Kindly share this video with your friends and families. You can watch this next video on your screen.